Nobody had touched him in 40 years, until that night with her. Every morning began the same way. The sun peeking softly through the curtains, the faint hum of birds outside, and the emptiness that seemed to echo louder than any sound he could hear. There were no voices calling his name, no laughter filling the rooms, and no hands reaching for his own. He had grown used to it, or so he told himself. He worked at a small shop in town, a place he had been employed for over 30 years. His coworkers were polite enough, exchanging greetings and small talk, but nothing more. He would nod quietly, help a customer find what they needed, and then retreat back to the quiet of the day. Conversations rarely lasted long with him. People sensed something unspoken in his eyes, a distance they did not dare to cross. Sometimes he would catch himself smiling faintly at a joke or a friendly remark, but even then, the smile felt like a mask, hiding the solitude he carried deep inside. Home was no different. The walls of his modest house were lined with memories of a life half-lived. There were photographs of family members he had lost touch with, friends who had moved away, and moments frozen in time that he could barely bring himself to remember. On the shelves, dusty books collected in silence, waiting to be opened but never truly read. He would sometimes pick one up, turn the pages, and then set it down, realizing that stories of other lives could never fill the emptiness of his own. He had friends once, long ago, in a life that now felt like someone else's dream. But over time, circumstances pulled them apart: marriages, moves, jobs, and deaths. Each loss had been quiet, almost invisible, leaving him with nothing but the echo of laughter and conversation that had once been so natural. People drifted away slowly, and he let them go, believing he could handle the quiet, thinking that solitude was safer than disappointment. Evenings were the hardest. The quiet in the house would stretch like a shadow, pressing against the walls and creeping into his chest. He would sit in his old armchair, staring at the dim glow of the lamp, wishing for something, anything, to break the monotony. Sometimes he would walk to the kitchen and make himself a cup of tea, not out of hunger, but simply to feel the motion of life around him. Each sip was warm, but it could not fill the emptiness he felt. He had grown accustomed to this routine, yet a part of him longed for change, for a connection that might never come. Sleep brought little comfort. Nights were long, and he often found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the years that had passed. Faces from his past would appear uninvited, reminding him of mistakes he had made, chances he had missed, and words left unsaid. Sometimes he would close his eyes tightly and imagine what it would be like to feel someone's hand on his shoulder, to hear a voice call his name with warmth, or to share a laugh with someone who truly cared. These thoughts would bring tears, quietly absorbed by the pillow, before he turned over and pretended to rest. Despite all this, he had a small spark of hope that he barely acknowledged. It was not hope for fame or wealth, nor for grand adventures. It was the hope that life might still hold a moment, a single chance, to break the long spell of solitude. It was a fragile thread, easy to ignore, but it persisted quietly in his heart. He told himself stories, imagining that maybe, someday, someone would notice him not for what he could do, but simply for who he was. He often walked through the small streets of his town, watching life pass by like a river he could never touch. Children ran past him, their laughter echoing in the air. Couples strolled hand in hand, sharing quiet conversations. Neighbors waved at each other warmly. He smiled politely at all of them, but the smiles never lingered. The world around him was full of touch, warmth, and connection, yet he remained an observer, untouched by the gestures that seemed so natural to everyone else. Shopping trips were lonely adventures. He would wander the aisles of the supermarket slowly, picking up what he needed, sometimes lingering at items that reminded him of life's simpler pleasures. A sweet he enjoyed as a child, a book that reminded him of old times, a photograph displayed on the cover of a magazine. People passed by, exchanging greetings with strangers, and he would nod quietly, feeling a pang of longing each time someone held the door open for another or shared a smile. These small interactions, though fleeting, reminded him of what he had missed, what he had lost, and what he secretly still desired. Even his hobbies were solitary. He had a few skills he practiced quietly, writing letters he never sent, gardening small patches of flowers that brightened his backyard, and repairing old furniture that no one else cared about. Each task brought a small satisfaction, a reminder that he was still capable of creating, of caring, of feeling. Yet, when the work was done, he would step back into the silence, and the void would return, pressing harder than before. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when he allowed himself to dream. He imagined someone walking through his door with a smile, greeting him warmly, and asking how his day had been. He pictured the sound of laughter filling his home, the warmth of a hand brushing against his discomfort, the simple joy of shared meals and quiet conversations. These dreams were fragile, almost too delicate to hold, yet they gave him a reason to wake each day and continue. People sometimes asked him why he remained so quiet, why he never married, why he lived alone. He would smile politely, offering vague answers, never revealing the depth of loneliness he carried. He had learned to protect himself, to hide the ache of decades spent in isolation. Vulnerability had become dangerous in his life, and so he kept his heart locked away, even as it quietly ached for connection. The man's life was a pattern, a rhythm of work, solitude, and fleeting thoughts of what could have been. He had built walls around himself so high that even he sometimes wondered if he could ever climb over them. Yet, within those walls, in the quiet corners of his heart, a small, persistent hope remained. It whispered that life was not yet finished, that perhaps there was still someone out there who could see him, not for what he had done, but for who he truly was. And so he continued day after day, year after year, carrying the weight of 40 years without touch, 40 years without the warmth of another human being. He did not complain, nor did he give up entirely. He simply existed, a quiet figure in a noisy world, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence that had defined his life for so long. The house remained quiet as night fell again, shadows stretching across the walls. He sat in his armchair, hands folded, staring at the dim light that barely illuminated the room. Somewhere deep inside, a spark flickered, a tiny, unspoken hope that tomorrow, or someday soon, might bring the connection he had longed for all his life. It was fragile, almost invisible, yet it persisted, reminding him that even after 40 years, the possibility of warmth, laughter, and touch had not completely vanished. And that was how he lived, day by day, quietly, patiently, holding on to a hope he barely admitted even to himself. A life of solitude, yes, but not entirely without dreams. Life continued in its quiet rhythm, but that rhythm was about to change in ways he never expected. It began on a day much like any other. He walked slowly through the streets of his small town, his hands in the pockets of his worn coat, his eyes scanning familiar sights. The bakery with its warm, fragrant air, the children playing near the fountain, their laughter ringing out across the square, the elderly couple sitting on a bench feeding birds from a small bag of crumbs. He noticed everything as he always did, but everything felt distant, untouchable, as though it belonged to another world that he could never truly enter. That afternoon, he made his way to the grocery store, the same one he had visited countless times over the years. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, the carts squeaked across the tiles, and the shelves were lined neatly with goods he had seen 1,000 times. He moved slowly down the aisles, carefully choosing what he needed, checking prices, examining labels, all in a quiet, automatic way. He noticed her first from across the produce section. She was standing by the apples, examining them thoughtfully, her fingers brushing lightly over the fruit. She had a gentle presence, quiet but somehow noticeable, a warmth that seemed to ripple around her even in the bright, sterile light of the store. She caught his eye briefly, and he looked away quickly, feeling a strange flutter he hadn't felt in decades. There was nothing dramatic about her appearance, just an ordinary woman, dressed simply, with a kind expression and eyes that seemed to notice things. But there was something about the way she held herself, the way she moved through the space, that made him pause. For the first time in many years, he felt curiosity, a spark that pulled him forward rather than holding him back. They met by accident, or at least it seemed accidental. He reached for a carton of milk at the same time as she did, their hands brushing lightly against each other. He pulled back instinctively, surprised by the contact, and she looked at him with a soft smile. "Sorry," she said, her voice gentle, calm, unjudging. "Go ahead." He shook his head quickly, muttering, "No, no, you take it," though his voice sounded tighter than he intended. Something in her manner, her patience, her kindness, made it easier for him to stay, to engage rather than retreat. From that small encounter, a conversation began. It was simple at first, polite, about the weather, the groceries, small daily matters. Yet even in those ordinary words, he felt something unusual, a connection, tentative and fragile, but undeniably there. He found himself smiling more than usual, feeling a lightness in his chest he had long forgotten. She spoke with a warmth that drew him out, making it easier to respond, easier to stay present rather than hiding behind his usual walls. Over the next days, he began to notice her more often in small ways. Sometimes she was at the store when he went to buy bread, other times at the library, quietly selecting books. He would see her from a distance, and his heart would quicken slightly, a subtle ache mixed with curiosity. He told himself to be cautious, to guard his heart, yet he found it harder and harder to resist the pull she seemed to exert. She did not seek attention, she did not flaunt herself. She simply existed with a presence that made the world around him feel warmer. He started changing small habits. He lingered in places he knew she might be, hoping for another chance encounter. He found excuses to visit the bookstore or the park, to buy slightly different groceries or walk a longer route. Each time he wondered if it was foolish, if he was letting himself hope too much. Yet the thought of her presence, even in passing, brought a sense of joy and anticipation that had been absent from his life for 40 years. Finally, one afternoon, their paths crossed in a way that allowed them to talk more freely. She was in the park, sitting on a bench with a small notebook, writing something carefully. He hesitated, unsure if he should approach, his old fear of rejection rising like a wall in front of him. But something inside him nudged forward, a quiet voice reminding him that life could still change. Summoning courage, he walked slowly toward her, each step heavy with uncertainty yet driven by hope. "Hello," he said softly, unsure if she would remember him. She looked up and her face brightened. "Hi," she replied warmly. "You're the one from the store, aren't you?" He nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. "Yes, I remember you." From that simple greeting they began to talk. It started with safe topics, the weather, the park, books they liked, the small pleasures of the day. But gradually the conversation deepened. She asked about his life in gentle, curious ways, and he found himself answering honestly, revealing small pieces of himself he had kept hidden for decades. It was strange, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. He had spent so long protecting himself from the world that the idea of opening up felt risky, but her patience made it possible. He learned that she was thoughtful, observant, and kind. She laughed at small jokes, shared stories of her own quiet life, and spoke in a way that made him feel understood. He realized how long it had been since anyone had truly listened to him, without judgment, without rushing, without looking away. Each moment with her built trust, a fragile bridge over the vast distance he had created between himself and the rest of the world. Days turned into weeks, and their encounters became more frequent. He would see her in the shop in the park, sometimes passing by each other on quiet streets. Each time, the conversations grew longer, more personal. He shared small dreams he had long abandoned, fears he had buried deep inside, and memories he had once thought painful. She listened without interruption, offering gentle encouragement, sometimes humor, sometimes quiet understanding. He felt seen in a way he hadn't in 40 years, as though someone finally recognized him as more than the lonely figure he had become. Despite this growing closeness, he wrestled with fear. His past had taught him that connections could be lost, that trust could be broken, and that the world often let you down. He worried about moving too quickly, about opening himself up and being rejected. Yet each time he hesitated, her presence reminded him that not everyone would turn away. Her patience, kindness, and consistent warmth slowly chipped away at the walls he had built around himself. He began to notice small details about her that made his heart race in ways he had long forgotten. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the softness of her voice when she asked a question, the quiet empathy in her eyes when she listened. Each detail, ordinary in itself, became extraordinary to him. He had spent so long without touch, without warmth, without human closeness, that even these small observations carried immense weight. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the town, painting the streets in gold and orange hues, they found themselves walking together after leaving the park. Conversation flowed easily, laughter spilling quietly between them. He felt a courage he had not known he possessed, the kind of courage that comes from recognizing the rare chance life has given you. In that moment, he realized that he was no longer just a man drifting through a lonely existence. He was someone on the cusp of rediscovery, someone willing to risk vulnerability for the possibility of connection. The more time he spent with her, the more he felt the stirrings of something he had long denied himself: hope. Hope that life could still surprise him, that human touch and warmth were not forever out of reach, that perhaps he could experience joy and closeness once more. Each encounter built layers of trust. Each smile shared became a small victory, each laugh a reminder that life, even after decades of solitude, could still offer unexpected beauty. And so, slowly but surely, the lonely man who had walked the streets for 40 years without touch began to experience life differently. He noticed the world with new eyes, not as a distant observer, but as someone who could engage, someone who could feel again. He did not yet know how far this connection would go, but for the first time in decades, he felt the warmth of companionship, the subtle thrill of being noticed, and the quiet joy that came from sharing moments with another human being who genuinely cared. Every day brought small steps, each encounter building toward something greater. The walls he had built around his heart were no longer as unyielding. The spark of hope, fragile but persistent, began to grow. And in that quiet, ordinary world of grocery stores, parks, and evening walks, he discovered the extraordinary possibility that life could still surprise him in the most meaningful ways. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet man began to notice a change inside himself that he had not felt for decades. He found himself thinking of her often, recalling the gentle tilt of her head when she listened, the warmth in her laughter, the kindness in her eyes. Each thought brought both comfort and fear. Comfort because it reminded him that connection was possible, fear because he had lived most of his life without it, and was uncertain if he could truly embrace it now. He had spent 40 years learning to protect himself. That protection had become a habit, almost instinctive, like a second skin. It was easier to remain silent, to avoid touch, to hide behind polite smiles and careful words. Vulnerability had always seemed dangerous. People could reject you, betray you, or disappear. 40 years of solitude had been his way of staying safe. Yet here she was, a living, breathing reminder that life could still hold something gentle, something real. And the very thought terrified him. The struggle within him was constant. On one hand, he wanted to reach out, to speak, to share, to feel. On the other, fear held him back. What if he was too late? What if she discovered the depth of his loneliness and thought him odd, or worse, unworthy of her attention? The questions swirled in his mind, creating a storm of hesitation. He would sometimes walk to the park where they had met, rehearsing words he might say, only to find that when the moment arrived, his courage faltered, and he returned home with nothing spoken. Yet she never seemed impatient or judgmental. Every encounter was gentle, unhurried, as though she sensed the walls he had built around himself and was willing to wait for him to lower them. That patience frustrated him and comforted him at the same time. It made him wonder if he could ever truly open up, if he was capable of letting someone in after all these years. He reflected on his past, the missed opportunities, the friendships that had faded, the family members he had lost touch with. He realized how much time he had allowed fear and pride to control his life. Now, with her, it felt as if the universe was offering him a chance to rewrite his story. One evening, he found himself walking to the park earlier than usual. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of flowers and earth. He spotted her sitting on their usual bench, a book in her hands, and for a moment he felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. What would they say? What could they talk about? The fear threatened to turn him back, to retreat to the safety of solitude. But he took a deep breath and approached, reminding himself that he had waited 40 years for this. Surely, a few moments of courage were worth it. "Good evening," he said softly, his voice carrying a nervous edge. She looked up and smiled, that warm, patient smile that had begun to feel like sunlight in his life. "Good evening," she replied. "I wasn't sure if you'd come today." Her words were simple, but they carried reassurance. She acknowledged his presence without pressuring him, leaving room for him to speak or not as he chose. It was a subtle gesture, but to him, it felt monumental. He realized how little he had been allowed to exist fully in someone else's attention for decades. And now, she offered it freely, without expectation, without judgment. Their conversation began cautiously, as it always did, but gradually it deepened. He spoke about the small details of his life, things he had never shared with anyone in years. The conversation was awkward at times. He stumbled over words, unsure of how much to reveal. But she listened, truly listened, her eyes reflecting understanding, her posture open and inviting. For the first time in decades, he felt heard, seen, and valued for who he was, not for what he could do or what he had lost. Despite the growing comfort, fear remained. He found himself questioning her intentions, analyzing every word and gesture. Was she simply being kind, or did she truly care? Could someone genuinely want to be close to him after all these years of isolation? These thoughts kept him awake at night, turning over possibilities and fears, creating a tension that was both exhilarating and exhausting. He began to notice physical reactions he had long forgotten. His heart would race slightly when she laughed near him. His palms would sweat during small gestures of closeness, like when their hands brushed while passing a notebook or exchanging a book at the library. These reactions frightened him as much as they thrilled him. He had been untouched for 40 years, and now even the smallest contact seemed overwhelming, carrying with it a flood of emotions he barely knew how to handle. The woman, perceptive as ever, seemed aware of his struggle. She never pushed him, never forced closeness, yet her presence was steady and comforting. She offered smiles, gentle laughter, and thoughtful questions that encouraged him to share without pressure. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to relax, realizing that vulnerability was not as dangerous as he had always feared. Perhaps, he thought, it was even possible that it could be rewarding. Still, the fear of failure haunted him. He worried about saying the wrong thing, about making a mistake that would push her away. He questioned whether he was worthy of attention, affection, or human closeness after such a long time alone. Some days the anxiety felt unbearable, and he would retreat to his home, sitting in the dim light of his living room, questioning if he was too late for happiness. He remembered the decades of loneliness, the nights spent staring at the ceiling, imagining life as it could have been. Now, with possibility so near, the weight of past decades felt heavier than ever. One particularly quiet evening, he decided to confront his fear, at least in part. He walked to the park with the intention of speaking more openly than he had before, to allow himself to show more of who he truly was. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the benches and pathways. She was there, as always, sitting with her book, and she looked up as he approached. The familiar smile met his eyes, gentle and encouraging. They began to talk, and he allowed himself to speak more honestly than ever. He shared memories of long-lost friends, moments of regret, and the deep ache of years spent in solitude. He spoke of his fear of rejection, his longing for connection, and the uncertainty he felt about opening his heart again. She listened silently, offering the occasional word of encouragement, her eyes never leaving his. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions. Tears came unbidden, though he did not try to hide them. She offered him a handkerchief, a gesture of simple kindness, and he realized how profoundly moving such a small act could be. It was not pity she offered, nor judgment, it was recognition, empathy, and genuine care. The moment was transformative. He began to understand that his fears, while real and understandable, did not have to control him any longer. Vulnerability did not necessarily lead to pain. It could also lead to connection, to warmth, to the human closeness he had longed for in silence. He felt a new courage rising within him, tentative but real, a courage that whispered he might finally be able to bridge the gap between the lonely life he had known and the possibility of companionship he had long denied himself. In the following days, he noticed subtle changes in himself. He walked with slightly more confidence, spoke with slightly more ease, and smiled with slightly more warmth. He was still cautious, still fearful at times, but the fear no longer dominated him. Each interaction with her was a small victory, a reminder that human connection was possible, even after decades of isolation. And yet, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. For 40 years, he had lived without touch, without intimacy, without closeness. To allow someone into that space, to experience the warmth and comfort of human contact again, required a leap he had never dared to take. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Every day, he wrestled with the tension between desire and fear, longing and hesitation. But he also realized something vital. He was not alone in this struggle. She was there, patiently, gently, offering the possibility of connection without forcing it. And for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to hope, not just for friendship, but for something deeper, something that could change the course of his life. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack, and through those cracks, light was beginning to shine. The man understood that his life was poised on the edge of transformation. He could continue as he had for 40 years, living quietly in isolation, or he could take the risk, embrace vulnerability, and allow himself to experience the warmth and touch he had been denied for so long. Fear remained, but alongside it grew courage, hope, and a tentative belief that perhaps life still held something beautiful for him. And so he waited, patient yet restless, fearful yet hopeful as the days continued to unfold. Every smile, every word, every gentle gesture from her was a reminder that life, even after decades of solitude, could still surprise him. He did not know what the future held, but he understood that he had a choice: to embrace the possibility of connection or retreat once more into the shadows of his lonely life. For the first time in 40 years, he felt ready to take that step. The night arrived quietly, without fanfare or warning, as if it had been waiting for this moment for decades. The man felt an unusual mix of anticipation and fear as he walked toward the small cafe where he and she had agreed to meet. The streets were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and the crisp air carried the faint scent of winter approaching. Every step felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the significance of what he was about to experience. He had thought about this evening for weeks, replaying conversations in his mind, imagining scenarios where everything might go perfectly or disastrously wrong. 40 years of solitude had made him cautious, suspicious even of the simplest gestures of warmth. Yet tonight, something inside him urged him forward. He was tired of waiting, tired of fearing the touch, the closeness, the connection he had longed for. Tonight, he decided, he would take a step into the unknown. She was already there when he arrived, seated at their usual quiet corner table. She smiled as he approached, a smile that held recognition, kindness, and patience all at once. It was the same smile that had drawn him in weeks ago, the one that had slowly chipped away at the walls he had built around his heart. He returned the smile, feeling his chest tighten in a way that was almost painful, but also strangely comforting. "Hello," she said softly, her voice carrying warmth that seemed to reach deep into his soul. "Hi," he replied, his own voice slightly shaky. I'm glad we could meet tonight." "Me too," she said, her eyes meeting his with a calm assurance that made him feel safe. They ordered simple drinks, tea for him, coffee for her, and sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, letting the atmosphere settle. He felt the familiar nervous flutter in his chest, a reminder of how long it had been since he had felt this kind of anticipation. Each second of waiting stretched out, heightening his awareness of every small detail. The way her fingers rested lightly on the table, the soft rhythm of her breathing, the gentle tilt of her head as she glanced at him. They began to talk, initially about small, everyday things. The weather, the quietness of the evening, the way the city looked under the soft glow of the lights. But gradually, the conversation deepened, as it always did. She asked questions with a gentle curiosity, encouraging him to share his thoughts, his memories, his fears. And for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to speak without holding back. He spoke of his life in quiet honesty, of the loneliness that had defined him for 40 years, of the longing for human connection he had buried deep inside. As he spoke, he realized how heavy the burden had been, how much weight he had carried alone. And now here she was, listening without judgment, without interruption, offering empathy and understanding. He felt the tightness in his chest begin to ease, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. The walls he had built so carefully over decades were beginning to crumble, brick by brick, as her presence filled the spaces he had long left empty. At one point, she reached across the table and lightly brushed her hand against his. It was a small gesture, almost accidental, yet it carried a significance he could not ignore. His breath caught, and for a moment he froze, unsure if he was ready to receive such contact. But she did not pull away, her touch gentle and reassuring. It was a quiet invitation, a signal that it was safe to let himself feel, to let himself be vulnerable. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the sensation sink in, feeling emotions he had long denied himself rise to the surface. Joy, relief, hope, and a touch of fear mingled in a strange, beautiful harmony. It was overwhelming yet grounding. He realized how much he had missed, how long he had gone without the simplest human gesture, touch. And now, after 40 years, he was finally allowing himself to experience it. The conversation continued, flowing naturally, seamlessly, as if the past decades of solitude had never existed. They laughed softly at shared memories and small jokes, exchanged stories of their lives, and sat in companionable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. Every glance, every word, every gesture became a thread weaving a tapestry of connection that he had long thought impossible. At one point, She reached out again, this time resting her hand more fully over his. He felt a shiver run through him, a mixture of awe, nervousness, and deep emotional release. He realized that this was more than just a touch. It was acceptance, recognition, and the beginning of healing. The human body, he understood suddenly, remembered what the heart had longed for all these years. The simple contact carried memories of comfort, safety, and belonging, reminding him of feelings he had almost forgotten. Tears welled in his eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of relief, of finally allowing himself to feel what he had denied for 40 years. She noticed, of course, and gently squeezed his hand, silently communicating that it was safe to let the emotions flow. He had spent a lifetime hiding, protecting himself from disappointment and pain, and now he understood that vulnerability could bring beauty, closeness, and profound connection. Time seemed to slow around them. The world outside the cafe, the noise, the streets, the passing cars, faded into the background. There was only this moment, this quiet space, this exchange of presence and touch. He felt a sense of peace he had never known, a deep, abiding sense that he was finally seen, finally valued, and finally able to share a piece of himself that had been locked away for too long. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to lean into the experience, to let go of the fears that had defined his life. He felt her warmth, her patience, her kindness, and in response, he opened a part of himself that he had long kept hidden. The night became a turning point, not in the form of dramatic events, but through subtle, profound shifts in his heart. He realized that human connection, even after 40 years of solitude, was not only possible but transformative. They spoke late into the evening, the conversation deepening into uncharted territory. He shared dreams he had long thought unattainable, fears he had buried deep, and hopes he had almost forgotten. She listened, offering insights, encouragement, and laughter that filled spaces he had long left empty. Every word, every gesture, every touch built a bridge between them, connecting two lives in ways that transcended time, distance, and loneliness. As the night drew on, he felt a sense of completion, not of an ending but of a beginning. He had crossed a threshold, allowing himself to experience touch, warmth, and connection after 40 years. He had faced fear and vulnerability, and found that it could lead not to pain, but to healing. He understood now that life could surprise him even at this stage, that joy and companionship could arrive unexpectedly, and that it was never too late to embrace the possibility of human closeness. When they finally stood to leave, the night air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and distant lights. He felt a lightness in his chest, a quiet exhilaration mixed with relief. The world seemed different now, not because it had changed, but because he had changed. He had stepped into the unknown, allowed himself to feel, and discovered that life could still offer moments of profound beauty and connection. As they parted that night, he walked home slowly, savoring the memory of the evening. He knew that this was only the beginning, that many steps remained to be taken, and that fear would continue to whisper in the shadows. But for the first time in 40 years, he felt hope, not fragile or tentative, but real and alive. He had touched, had been touched, had shared, had connected. And that night, more than anything, he understood that life, even after decades of solitude, could still hold extraordinary moments of warmth, love, and human connection. The house was quiet when he returned, as it always was, but the emptiness no longer pressed so heavily against the walls. Something inside him had shifted. He had faced fear, embraced vulnerability, and experienced a night that would remain etched in his heart forever. For the first time in 40 years, he went to bed not with the ache of longing, but with the quiet, steady glow of hope, and the knowledge that human connection, once lost, could indeed be found again. The days following that night were unlike any he had experienced in decades. He woke in the morning with a quiet sense of anticipation, a feeling he had long forgotten. The air in his small home seemed lighter, brighter, filled with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. For 40 years, he had risen each day to the same routine, moving mechanically through life. But now, even the smallest tasks felt different. Making breakfast, tidying the living room, stepping outside into the sun, all of it seemed infused with a subtle, new energy. He thought often of her, the warmth of her smile, the gentleness of her hand, the calm patience that had allowed him to open his heart. It amazed him that something so simple, touch, presence, kindness, could have such a profound effect. He realized how starved he had been for connection, for human contact, for the quiet reassurance that someone truly saw him. And yet, in her company, he had discovered that it was possible to feel whole again, even after decades of loneliness. He began to take small steps to change his life. For the first time in years, he found joy in small outings. He walked through the streets with a lighter step, noticing details he had overlooked for decades. The way sunlight danced across the pavement, the sound of children laughing as they played, the scent of flowers in a nearby garden. He smiled at people he passed, and to his surprise, some smiled back warmly, as though sensing a new openness in him. The world seemed less distant now, less intimidating, because he carried within him a spark of warmth and connection that had been absent for far too long. His interactions with her became a cornerstone of this new life. They met frequently, sometimes in the park, sometimes at quiet cafes, sometimes simply walking together along familiar streets. Each meeting was a reminder that life could hold moments of beauty, and that even after decades of solitude, it was possible to feel a closeness that nourished the heart. They shared stories, laughter, and quiet conversation. She encouraged him to pursue interests he had long neglected, and he found himself exploring new hobbies, joining small groups, and even revisiting old passions that had brought him joy in his younger years. One afternoon, they visited a small garden on the outskirts of town. The flowers were in full bloom, colors vivid against the gentle green of the grass. He walked slowly, taking in the scene, his hand brushing hers as they walked side by side. That simple contact, light and reassuring, brought a sense of peace he had not known he could feel. He realized that intimacy did not always have to be grand or dramatic. It could be quiet, subtle, and profoundly meaningful. The world seemed richer, more vibrant, simply because someone shared it with him. At home, he began to change as well. He cleaned his space with care, arranged photographs and books thoughtfully, and even started cooking meals he had long ignored. The house no longer felt like a silent prison. It became a sanctuary, a place where he could experience the joy of living fully and openly. He began to write letters, not to send, but to record thoughts, dreams, and reflections he had long suppressed. Writing became a bridge between the man he had been and the man he was becoming, a way to connect with his own emotions and give them space to breathe. He noticed subtle changes in himself as well. He laughed more easily, his conversations were more fluid, and he began to speak with a confidence that had been absent for decades. His steps were lighter, his posture more open, and his eyes carried a spark of warmth that others noticed. People around him sensed the shift, even if they did not understand its origin. Where once he had been distant, polite but withdrawn, now he engaged more fully with the world, drawn by the possibility of connection and the courage to embrace it. The bond with her deepened gradually. They shared quiet evenings, simple meals, and long walks where conversation flowed easily. He learned about her life, her joys, her struggles, her dreams, and she learned about his. With each shared moment, he felt less like the man who had spent 40 years alone and more like someone who belonged somewhere, who mattered to someone, and who could once again trust in the goodness of human connection. One evening, they returned to the cafe where they had first shared that transformative night. The familiar corner table, the gentle lighting, and the soft murmur of other patrons felt different now. It felt like a place where he could fully exist, unguarded and open. They spoke of memories and dreams, of hopes for the future, and of the lessons life had taught them. And for the first time, he realized that happiness was not a distant, fleeting concept. It was possible to feel it here and now, even in simple, quiet moments. He reflected often on the journey he had traveled. 40 years of solitude had shaped him, yes, but it had not destroyed his capacity to feel, to connect, or to hope. The pain of loneliness had made the moments of warmth and connection all the more precious. He understood now that life could be unpredictable, that joy could arrive unexpectedly, and that human connection was worth the courage it demanded. Each day became a reminder that he was capable of growth, of love, and of truly living again. In the weeks that followed, he began to expand his life beyond the small routines that had defined him for so long. He visited the local library, joined small community groups, and even began volunteering in modest ways, sharing his time and attention with others. The connections he formed in these new experiences were smaller, quieter, but no less significant. He discovered the joy of seeing others smile, of being helpful, and of feeling valued in ways that extended beyond his relationship with her. Yet through all these changes, the relationship with her remained the center of his life. It was a source of comfort, joy, and gentle challenge. She encouraged him to explore his feelings, to express gratitude, and to trust that he was worthy of attention and affection. In return, he shared himself fully, unguarded, and sincere, finding in her presence a mirror for his own heart, reflecting the love, care, and humanity he had long denied himself. One day, he realized that he had begun to imagine a future he had once thought impossible. A life not defined by solitude but by shared moments, companionship, and trust. He could see himself laughing, speaking freely, and being touched, both emotionally and physically, in ways that felt safe, nurturing, and profoundly meaningful. It was a vision of life that he had thought had passed him by forever, yet now it seemed not only possible but within reach. He also noticed the small, everyday joys he had overlooked before. The warmth of the sun on his face, the aroma of fresh bread, the sound of children playing nearby, the laughter of friends in the park. These simple moments now carried richness and depth. They were no longer just passing observations. They were experiences shared, moments of connection that reminded him life could be tender, joyful, and worth embracing fully. In quiet reflection, he realized that the transformation he had undergone was not sudden but gradual, built on trust, patience, and the courage to allow himself to feel again. 40 years of solitude had taught him the value of moments, the importance of presence, and the depth of human need for connection. And now he understood that life could still hold extraordinary experiences, that love and companionship were never out of reach, and that it was never too late to begin again. His home, once a place of silence and shadows, became a space of warmth and welcome. He invited friends, shared meals, and engaged in conversations that nourished both mind and spirit. The man who had spent 40 years untouched now moved through life with a sense of belonging, knowing that connection, once lost, could be regained. Each day brought new opportunities, small victories, and the quiet joy of feeling alive once more. And as he lay in bed each night, he thought of her, the gentle, patient woman who had helped him rediscover himself. He felt gratitude that went beyond words, a recognition that some people enter our lives and change them in ways that cannot be measured. She had shown him that warmth, touch, and human closeness were not privileges to be feared but gifts to be embraced. She had reminded him that life, even after decades of waiting, could surprise us with moments of grace, joy, and love. He understood now that the story of his life was not defined solely by the 40 years of loneliness, but by the courage he had shown in stepping into the unknown, by the hope he had nurtured quietly, and by the willingness to allow someone into the deepest parts of his heart. That night had changed him, and the days that followed had proven that transformation was possible. He had been touched, truly and deeply, and in that touch he had discovered life, love, and a sense of belonging that he had thought lost forever. And so he continued, each day building upon the last, embracing life with an openness and courage that had been hidden for decades. His story, once defined by isolation, was now one of hope, warmth, and human connection. And he knew, with quiet certainty, that he would never again take such moments for granted, that he would carry the lessons of that night and the weeks that followed with him always, living fully, feeling deeply, and loving openly at last.